Going live. Yes, finally. Ugh. Tech Ghost visited me too. Thanks. Thanks, Tech Ghost. Right. All right, I'm officially live. Oh, I'm so happy. Okay. Let me put this on Discord real quick. Okay. I'm officially live. Just a second. All right. Gotta put this on Discord real fast. Okay. I'm. All right. One more. One more, then I can start. I'm officially live. Oh, why is this so slow? Okay, there we go. All right. Good morning. All right. All right. Today I'm reading. I'm reading The Journey Begins. It is a book based on the show Road to Avonlea, which, if you all don't know, it is a spinoff of the Anne of Green Gables films from Kevin Sullivan, which were in turn adapted from the books by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Okay, let me read the back. Road to Avonlea, the journey begins. Sarah Stanley's life is turned upside down when her adored father is threatened with financial ruin. To protect her from scandal during this crisis, he determines to send her and her nanny Louisa from their Montreal mansion to Prince Edward Island, her late mother's birthplace, and home to a family she has never known. Thus begins Sarah's journey on the road to Avonlea. Adapted from the award-winning international acclaimed television series, the magical adventures of the Story Girl continue in the spirit and tradition of Lucy Maud Montgomery for a new generation of young readers. All right. All right, and this was written by Dennis Adair and Janet Rosenstock. Right. Chapter 1. Come along, urged Nanny Louisa. You're daydreaming, aren't you? Sarah Stanley walked by her nanny's side. It was a glorious, wonderful day, the kind of day that comes only in late summer. The lawns of Westmount, the district in Montreal where Sarah lived with her father, all appeared neatly groomed, their hedges cut to perfection, and their well-kept flower beds filled with late-blooming summer blossoms. Sarah's eyes fell on the rows of brightly colored chrysanthemums. That's a hard word to say. Chrysanthemums, which waved on their long stems like ballerinas. I was just thinking of waltzing flowers, Sarah confessed. Nanny Louisa smiled. The things that come into your head always surprise me, Sarah Stanley. Sarah's nanny knew her to be an imaginative girl given to flights of fancy and romantic daydreams. Others who knew 12-year-old Sarah Stanley either envied or pitied her. A poor lonely child, one acquaintance sighed each time she saw Sarah with her nanny. A spoiled child who spends too much time with adults, whispered another. She should have playmates, insisted still another. Imagine taking a child to Egypt. It's a scandal. Who knows what she might see in a place like that, one maiden lady huffed. Those who pitied Sarah Stanley knew she traveled a great deal, that she had few friends her own age, and that, above all, she was a child whose mother had died when she was only 3. Those who envied her thought Nanny Louisa tended to Sarah's every need, that Sarah's father spoiled her, and that far, far too much was spent on her clothes, toys, and tutoring. Oh, my side hurts for a second. Okay, let's see. The truth was harder to find. Sarah was a mystery to many people, and sometimes she was a mystery even to herself. One minute she felt confident and brave, the next a little frightened and unsure of herself. Sarah and Nanny turned onto Victoria Avenue, a grand street lined with old maple trees which shaded the sidewalk from the late August heat. The ladies and gentlemen strolling along were stylishly dressed. The women wore wonderful summer straw hats trimmed with bows. Satin bows. I can't talk. You can sing. Satin bows. Crap, I lost my place. Okay, with satin bows and delicate handmade silk flowers from Spain. Many carried frilly parasols, and all of them wore the scent of flowery sachets, eau de cologne, sorry if I mispronounced that, or fine perfume. Sarah gave Nanny's hand a squeeze and skipped on ahead. Nanny was a small woman, and because she was small as well as elderly, she walked slowly, far too slowly for Sarah, who felt the urge to run. Don't go too far, Nanny Louisa cautioned. You just slow down and come back here, Miss Sarah, Nanny called out. She grasped the straw bonnet that sat precariously atop her large gray bun. Wisps of hair escaped and caressed her forehead, and her little glasses slipped over her nose, and she bustled along. Sarah stopped and waited for her to catch up. When she was younger, Nanny Louisa had played with her, instructed her, and taken care of her. But now Sarah wanted to do things for herself. As much as Sarah loved her, Nanny Louisa was always lecturing, and she lectured more when they'd been shopping as they had today. I hadn't finished talking to you, Nanny Louisa scolded. She shook her head. Buying that dress was sheer extravagance. Sarah smiled sweetly. Oh, Nanny Louisa, please don't fuss so. You know Papa promised I could choose my own dress. Besides, the shop girl said it's the color of the moonlight, silvery and shimmery. Couldn't you just imagine yourself in a dress the color of moonlight? As if moonlight had a real color, Nanny muttered. Besides, were there such a color, which there isn't, you could see right through it because it would be transparent. The color of the moonlight, indeed. I don't know where you get your romantic notions. No, I can't imagine myself in such a dress. And make no mistake, Sarah Stanley, there's nothing less becoming than a young lady with puffed up airs. Ah, Nanny Louisa is such a blah, blah. Okay. Sarah wanted to say that she could see the color of the moonlight in her mind's eye, but it didn't matter. Nanny Louisa's lecture went right in one ear and out the other. As they approached their grand house, Sarah could see her father's shiny new electric Packard parked in the circular drive. Nanny Louisa, look, Papa's home. Sarah ran towards the house, her heart pounding with anticipation. How wonderful it would be when she was old enough for Papa to to take her on all his business trips. How grand never to have to stay home with only with Nanny Louisa. Not that they didn't travel together now, but Sarah didn't think vacations were enough. She wanted to be with her father all the time. Sarah, now you wait for me. Do you hear? Nanny's voice was a distant sound as Sarah tore down the street and into the wide circular drive. In his stiff black uniform, the chauffeur, Charles, stood beside the Packard holding a polishing cloth. Good afternoon, Miss Sarah. Charles bowed his head. Good afternoon. Sarah bolted past him. She stopped short at the front door. Two men were coming out. They had long, grim expressions on their faces, rather as if they had just eaten a jar of sour pickles. Behind them, Emma, the maid, stood dabbing her eyes, nervously running her hand over her dark skirt. Thank you, miss, one of the men said to Emma. Good day, sir, Emma managed to respond. It sounded to Sarah as if Emma had something caught in her throat. Why was she crying? Perhaps these strange men had come to give poor Emma bad news. Are you all right? Sarah asked. Emma nodded. Where's Papa? Sarah was breathless. In his study, Miss Sarah, but you mustn't. Sarah swept past Emma and ran down the corridor toward the winding staircase that led to her father's second floor study. Nanny Louisa finally reached the front steps. That child is irresponsible, she said, smiling. Emma still stood in the doorway, her face ashen, tears running down her cheeks. Whatever is the matter? Nanny Louisa asked, putting her hand on Emma's arm. Emma pressed her lips together. Oh, you haven't heard the news? It's dreadful. I don't know what's going to happen. Nanny Louisa frowned. Do stop crying, she said primly. Now come into the parlor and tell me what's happened. Tell me slowly and rationally. Crying never helped anything. It stuffs up your nose and makes your eyes red. It's unattractive, and I'm sure it's unnecessary. Emma looked into Louisa's stern face and burst into even louder sob. Terrible! It's terrible! What will become of us? What? Chapter 2. As Sarah hurried to welcome her father home from England, she could not have guessed that at this very moment he was facing the most difficult moment of his entire life. She flung open the door of his huge study. Most difficult moment? Like, what about, I don't know, when his wife died? She flung open the door of the huge study. The great leather chair, his favorite, was empty, and a strange man stood by its side. He was a tall man, and he wore a dark suit. He had thin hair and wore a serious expression on his angular face. There were two other men as well, whom Sarah recognized. They were sitting in the three straight back chairs in front of her father's massive, highly polished mahogany desk. One had a handlebar mustache, and the other wore funny little glasses and had a beard. But it was her father who seized Sarah's full attention. He looked tired and worried, and she ran up to him, concerned. Okay. Why did these pages stick together? Okay. Papa, you're back. I've missed you so much. She buried her face in his chest, then looked up. Is everything all right? Blair Stanley forced a smile. Sarah, it's wonderful to see you, my darling. How was England, Papa? Her father put his arms around her and gave her a big bear hug. Whatever it was these guests wanted, they would surely understand. After all, her papa had been gone for a long time and they had missed each other. Her mother had died when she was 3, and she had no brothers or sisters. It was just she and Papa, and Nanny Louisa, of course. Only with her father, though, did Sarah share the wonderful secret, mysterious world of her imagination. Only her father understood her qualities, her desires, her dreams, and only she understood him. He was a gifted, sensitive, and creative man. He was and brave, too. In Sarah's eyes, he was all the best things a person could be. She loved him fiercely, and and knew in her heart that they needed each other. Oh, Papa, Sarah returned his hug. Tonight, everything would be as it should be. Papa would sit in his favorite chair, and she would sit in his lap, and they would read together as they had on so many happy evenings. He read to her from St. Nicholas Magazine and from Grimm's Fairy Tales and Hans Christian Andersen, wonderful stories about fairies and elves, about kings and queens, princes and princesses. Now, though, more often than not, it was she who read the stories. You read with great expression, he told her. The compliment made her try harder. Now each story she read was like a play. She imitated voices, she became the characters. Tonight she would act out a fine story, a new and special one to read to him on his return. Her father released her from his arms and smiled. Sarah, you know Mr. Bartholomew, my lawyer, and Mr. Heinrich, my vice president. Hello, Sarah smiled, trying to appear warm and friendly, as she was certain her papa would want. But goodness, they all looked so serious. Then she remembered Emma, who had been crying, and a feeling of foreboding flooded over her. Mr. Heinrich shifted his weight from one foot to another. His face was flushed. Hello, Sarah. My, haven't you grown? He always said he always said that when he saw her. It was rather a silly comment since he saw her only every 6 months or so. She was bound to grow. And this is Mr. Stewart, her father introduced the gentleman standing by the leather chair. I'm pleased to meet you, Mr. Stewart, Sarah said politely, but Mr. Stewart didn't seem very polite. He simply nodded. Sarah looked up at her father. His brow was knitted in a frown. Sarah, I'm afraid I can't talk to you right now, and all I'll have to work. I can't talk. And I'll have to work tonight. I keep getting tongue-tied. Did this mean her story would have to wait? Sarah searched her father's troubled eyes. He couldn't hide anything from her. She knew something had happened. He rose and stepped to the door of the study. Louisa, he called. In seconds, Nanny Louisa appeared. Then he turned back to his daughter. I'm sorry, Sarah. Something has happened, and it requires my attention. But Papa, I'll be in to see you later, my darling. We'll talk before you go to sleep. Now, now you go off and have your tea like a good girl. Oh my gosh. So stuffed up today. But Papa, Oh, wait, I already read that part. Okay. Sarah frowned. It was only afternoon. Was Papa going to stay closeted with these grim looking men for hours and hours? Her father looked pleadingly into her eyes. Please, Sarah, go with Nanny Louisa. She hesitated because whatever was wrong, she wanted her father to share it with her, but she yielded to Nanny Louisa, who had gently taken her arm. Before she left, she turned and kissed him. Promise you'll come later? He bit his lip and nodded. I promise, Sarah. Blair Stanley waited until the heavy door was closed and he knew Sarah couldn't hear. Then he returned to his desk and sank into the chair behind it. He covered his face with his hands, wondered wondered silently how events could have taken such a terrible turn. Regarding his composure, he looked up at his somber companions. I don't understand any of this. What do you mean you can't find Abernathy anywhere? Lawrence Abernathy was an accountant, the man he'd placed in charge of of the finances of Stanley Imports. He had trusted Abernathy above all others. Apparently, it was a trust misplaced. Gordon Bartholomew rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Your Mr. Abernathy has simply disappeared, Blair. Vanished. Stanley Imports has been sucked dry, Mr. Heinrich added. He didn't just take your money, Blair. Abernathy appears to be an experienced embezzler. He's been wily enough to put you alone in the seat of suspicion. There are prepaid orders for expensive imported furnishings and works of art. Valued customers didn't receive their goods, nor were suppliers paid. And a good many of the customers were large stores, some of them publicly held companies, Bartholomew added. There's bound to be a lot of press, especially once the news hits the stock market, Heinrich added. I've employed Abernathy for years. I trusted him implicitly. Disbelief was evident in Blair Stanley's voice. He shrugged and shook his head. Well, I'm afraid you'll have to deal with this, gentleman. It's imperative I go to Toronto next week. I can't cancel. The third man, Mr. Stewart, who had remained silent, stepped out from behind the leather chair and approached Blair's desk. I'm afraid you don't understand the conditions of your bail, Mr. Stanley. He spoke calmly, flatly. You are under house arrest. You can't go anywhere. Blair Stanley looked up into Stewart's eyes as the terrible implications of his situation began to hit him. Events had moved swiftly that morning in court. Bartholomew had spoken to the judge and assured him there was no question of failure to meet responsibility. Finally, he'd been released when Bartholomew had signed the necessary documents, bonds, and the like. Blair's eyes sought Bartholomew now, and Bartholomew nodded silently. House arrest, Blair said in a slightly shaky voice. It sounded so dreadful, and immediately he thought of Sarah. How could he keep this from her? Chapter 3. That night, as Sarah lay in bed waiting for her father, Nanny Louisa tiptoed down the darkened hall. She thanked heaven that the carpet was thick enough to muffle the sound of her footsteps, and she prayed that the dishes on the tray she carried would not rattle and shake. Excuse me. My ears are so stuffed up. Louisa. I'm sorry. Louisa stopped outside the study from under the closed doors. She could see the triangle of light that shone from Blair's desk lamp. Cautiously, quietly, she opened the door, balancing the tray in one experienced hand. She slipped inside. Blair looked up. Strangely, he had admitted he'd never really noticed how old Nanny Louisa was, nor till this moment had he thought about her age. But tonight, dressed as she was in her encompassing dark velvet dressing gown, her gray hair nodded firmly atop her head. She did look older than he usually thought of her. Certainly, he reminded himself, she must have been close to 60 when Ruth, his wife, died 9 years ago. Louisa had been his own nanny, but he couldn't remember how she'd looked in those days. She'd always been there. She was someone he took for granted. How kindly she really was. She'd brought him some dinner. He looked at her and shook his head and waved his hand. No, please, Louisa, dear. I'm really not hungry. You've got to eat, Louisa said firmly. It was a tone of voice he knew. It was a tone of voice he knew well. She often spoke to Sarah in that same tone, and heaven knows she'd used it with him when he was a boy. Louisa was strict yet warm. She was an old willow that could bend, and she was ferocious in her protection of him and Sarah. She lifted a sharply arched brow. You're cranky when your stomach's empty. Even as a boy, the moods you would get yourself into. Now, Nanny Louisa, don't fuss, he said wearily. She set the tray down in front of him and leaned over the desk. Now, she said, as if he were still 10 years old himself, I want you to tell me what's going on, Blair Stanley. Emma and Cook are downstairs still caterwauling about bankruptcy and house arrest and goodness knows what else. He looked into her eyes. They weren't as blue as they had once been, and he knew she didn't see as sharply as before. As firm as her voice was, though, her eyes were not accusative. I think that's how you say it. Accusative. Her eyes were not accusative. They were concerned. Strangely, her questions gave him comfort. He could count on Louisa to be level-headed. She was the most level-headed woman alive, almost too level-headed. Well, she said, questioning his silence, I'm afraid I put too much trust in my accountant, Mr. Abernathy. Okay, sorry, I gotta do something real quick. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. Just a second. Oh my gosh. Ears are so stopped up today. Where was I? Almost too level-headed. Well, she said, questioning his silence, I'm afraid I put too much trust in my accountant, Abernathy. My accountant, Mr. Abernathy. Louisa folded her arms defiantly. So Mr. Abernathy turned out to be all show and no substance, did he? I never trusted that two-faced Philistine. Does this mean that what I hear downstairs is true? Blair nodded. I returned from England and was presented with a warrant for my arrest. Excuse me. Arrest? You're a man with a fine reputation. Surely no court of law will listen to his word against yours. I'm afraid it's not a matter of words. Abernathy covered his tracks. He's taken the money and disappeared. I'll have to make good on everything. It will ruin me. Blair shook his head as if he didn't quite believe his own words. Do you have enough to settle your claims your claims held against you? Probably not, Louisa. I may go to jail. Louisa let out a long breath as if she'd been holding it in. Oh, Blair, it's bad enough for you, but what about Sarah? Blair looked up at her intently. Sarah is troubling me most. She has to be protected from this at all costs. I don't want her dragged through something she's not old enough to understand. It's true, I have many hard decisions to make about the business, Louisa, but what shall I do about Sarah? Louisa turned and walked slowly over to the empty, cold fireplace. Yes, she must be protected. Sarah must go away for a while until your innocence is proven. That would be ideal, but where could she go? I'd gladly send the two of you to Europe, but there's no money. Nanny Louisa paced before the fireplace, then suddenly stopped. Didn't Ruth have relatives on Prince Edward Island? Yes, that would be perfect. Sarah wouldn't be under scrutiny there. It's a million miles from nowhere, but quite pleasant, I understand. Blair stood up defiantly, his voice almost exploding. Over my dead body! I will never give my wife's overbearing sister the satisfaction of me to of that. Okay, let me start over. Over my dead body, I will never give my wife's overbearing sister the satisfaction of knowing my financial situation. She never wanted me to marry Ruth. You remember, I've told you about Hetty King. No, no, it's out of the question. Louisa spun around to face him. She could be fierce too, and as she saw it, Blair didn't have many options. Your pride is interfering with your common sense. Hetty doesn't need to know your situation. Simply cable her cable her that you've been called away on a lengthy business venture, and this would be a perfect time for Sarah to get to know her mother's relatives. Blair stared at Louisa. He drew in his breath, carefully considering her rather firm suggestion, and then nodded slowly. I suppose that could work. This Hetty King may be an old tyrant, Blair, but she isn't Sarah's only relative on Prince Edward Island. Hetty runs the family. She's the eldest. She turned them all against me. When Ruth died, she blamed me. Swallow your pride, Blair. Think about your daughter. She must be taken out of Montreal. Blair nodded slowly. I suppose you're right. I suppose Sarah might enjoy her cousins. Not that they're like my Sarah. Louisa smiled fondly. No one is like our Sarah, she agreed. Now, Blair, go to her and tell her what we planned. Kiss her good night. I know she's waiting and she won't sleep a wink till you appear. Oh, drop something. This is like a picture from the show, and is included in this, but it keeps falling out of the book. I mean, this book is from 1991. So yeah, it's kind of an old book. All right. While Nanny Louisa and her father talked, Sarah lay thinking and worrying about her father. She was reading, but at the same time listening. When she heard her father's footsteps, she put down her book. Papa, she called as he quietly opened the door. Ah, you're not asleep. I've been waiting for you. Nanny said you'd come. Her father smiled and sat down at the edge of the bed. He ran his hand through Sarah's hair. brushing a few stray strands off her forehead. I'm sorry I was so short with you this afternoon, Sarah. I've had some bad news. A setback in business, you might say. I'm afraid it's too complicated to explain to you. Sarah looked at her father with concern. Is it very serious trouble? He shook his head. No, not at all. Just a little financial matter I hope will be cleared up within a month. But you won't notice the time. It will fly by. Fly by? Sarah questioned. Sarah, I'm going to be terribly busy, and most of the business will have to be carried on right here in this house. I'm afraid it would be difficult. I'm afraid it would difficult for both of us if you were about. I think that's found a typo. It's supposed to say, I'm afraid it would be difficult for both of us if you were about. Okay, he forced a smile. You distract me, and the truth is, I just won't have time to be with you. If I'm not here, where will I be? Sarah asked, sitting up on her bed. I'm sending you and Nanny on a wonderful vacation to Prince Edward Island. You're going to visit your aunts, uncles, and cousins. He leaned towards her. Sarah, you'll have a wonderful time. But what about my tutors? Perhaps you'll go to school for a while on the island, he smiled. That will be an experience, Sarah. It will be a grand adventure. I'd rather stay here. Oh, Papa, do I have to go? My darling, I know this will be all cleared up soon. Sarah met his eyes. We've always gone on vacations together, she reminded him. Her father kissed her cheek. I know, but I must stay here. I will send for you as soon as possible. You know I will. Do you promise? I promise. Now you will make an adventure of this, won't you? Do you remember when we sailed the Nile and saw the pyramids? Sarah nodded. Of course I remember, but we were together then. Oh, why can't you come with us? If I would, I could. But I want you to enjoy yourself, Sarah. You know how much Mama would have loved you to meet her family in Avonlea. Well, you're old enough now. It's fitting that you should go. Sarah tilted her head thoughtfully. It will be interesting to be with a real family. I mean, a big one with aunts and uncles and everything, won't it? That's my girl, her father said, smiling broadly and slapping the quilt with mock enthusiasm. Sarah bit her lip. I will miss you, Papa. He leaned over and hugged her tightly. Oh, how I'll miss you too, Sarah. I'll miss you every hour of every day. And you'll write? Of course I will. And I'll write to you. I'll write every day. I can't help, I can't keep up with that. Perhaps every few days or every week. Sarah kissed her papa's cheek. At least every week, she whispered. Excuse me. Throat hurts today. For a long time, her after her father left, Sarah lay awake, looking around her bedroom. How she would miss it when she was gone. By one window, there was a comfortable window seat, and on either side of it were shelves filled with Sarah's favorite books. Many of her baby toys had been put away, but certain items remained. A rag doll, a large ball, and of course, her rolling hoop and stick were things she seldom played with for now, but still liked to have about. She had a wonderful little puppet theater with 4 different backdrops and 11 hand puppets. She also had 3 dolls dressed in satin and lace and high-heeled shoes. Her pride and joy, however, was her dollhouse. It was 2 stories high, had 9 rooms, and was completely furnished in miniatures. In the grand living room, there were even 2 tiny Oh my gosh. Okay. There were two tiny hand painted drawings in a miniature frames. The table in the dining room was set with china dishes, and there was a miniature tea kettle on the stove in the little kitchen. Quite the most wonderful dollhouse in all of Montreal, Nanny had proclaimed. Not as fine as the one that belonged to the Queen of England, but close. Still, Sarah had to admit that the most wonderful dollhouse in the world couldn't make you happy if you were sad. Lately, she had been a little sad. She wished she could play without Nanny looking on, that she could have friends like other children seemed to have. Sarah blinked into the darkness of of her room. She would miss Papa, but perhaps going to Prince Edward Island would be an adventure. Perhaps Papa was right. Chapter 4. The train crept through a unlike pastoral landscape, unlike any Sarah had ever seen before. Not only were the houses few and far between, but the land itself looked as if it could have been painted by the great artist Vincent van Gogh. Yes, there was no doubt about it. The earth of Prince Edward Island, all the earth she could see from the train, including the dirt road that ran by the rail track, was bright red. It was so red it was a curiosity. She wondered if one of her science tutors could have explained the phenomenon. The red earth made the red earth made the grass look even greener, while the hillsides of wildflowers added even more color. The scenery was vivid, and the houses she saw were quaint, rather like cottages inhabited by the elves in her storybooks. How unusual it is here, Sarah remarked to Nanny Louisa, while continuing to look out the window. Imagine how the moonlight must look when it shimmers on the sea and the hills. Desolate, if you ask me, Nanny concluded. Wow, such a pleasant person. Sarah ignored Nanny's comment. Nanny Louisa did not suffer change gladly, and she was always fussing and grumbling when faced with anything out of the ordinary. In Sarah's eyes, though, the scenery was far from lonely. It was exciting, and more important, it seemed inviting. This would be an adventure. Sarah thought back over the past few days. It had all happened so quickly, and she still didn't understand why Mr. Bartholomew and not her papa had escorted them to the station. Sarah looked at the seat across from them in the coach, where a boy, a little older than Sarah, sat by himself. For almost an hour, Nanny Louisa had been scrutinizing him. He appeared to be about 13, with a strong and sturdy build. His unruly light brown hair kept falling over his forehead. After a time, she asked, "Are you traveling alone, child?" At that moment, the boy grinned and opened his waistcoat. A small mouse peered out. "Except for Edgar," the boy said, indicating the mouse. No sooner had the words escaped him than Edgar, the mouse, popped out of his pocket and ran down the seat across the floor towards Nanny Louisa. Sarah thought that in all her life she had never seen Nanny Louisa move so quickly. She shrieked and jumped up onto the seat, and Sarah, stunned, did the same. Hearing the screams, the conductor appeared almost instantly. And what is going on here?" he questioned gruffly. This boy has a live rodent, Nanny complained. Sarah, having recovered, announced, "This ruffian has frightened my nanny." The conductor removed the boy immediately, but the mouse was lost. In the hours that followed, Nanny kept a wary lookout for Edgar. Finally, she stood up, straightened her hat, and advised, "We'd better get ourselves together." "So soon? Are we almost there?" Nanny Louisa sighed deeply. "Oh, would that it were so. Would that it were so. Would that it were so." I think that's a typo. "Oh, would that if it were so. No, this train only takes us as far as Bright River. God willing, your mother's brother will pick us up there. What a frightful journey. My stars." Two porters knocked on the compartment door and, once admitted, began to take numerous cases and hat boxes away. Nanny Louisa followed them down the corridor. "Don't be don't be careful," do be careful, she warned. "Don't crush that large white box. Oh, do be careful." Sarah followed in her wake, suppressing a smile. The train jolted to a halt, and the conductor swung down and pulled out the iron steps. The porters carried out the luggage. They had to make two trips. "Aren't you going to put it in the station?" Nanny Louise asked. The more concerned, then more concerned. "Where is the station?" Excuse me. "Over there," Sarah pointed. It wasn't really a station. It was merely a covered part of the platform, with a small part actually enclosed. From its red roof, a big sign dangled which declared in bold letters, "Bright River Station." Excuse me. Bright River Station. The porters climbed back on the train, and the conductor signaled the engineer. Sarah and Nanny Louisa could not see him, but the boy, who had shared the carriage for a while anyway, jumped gingerly from the very last car, darted across the platform, and disappeared behind the station. Then, with a sudden bellow, the whistle, the train, or with the bellow of the whistle, the train came once again to life, and like a great fire-eating dragon, chugged off. "My stars," Nanny Louisa breathed. There's no one here. Not a single solitary soul. But it is lovely, isn't it? It's so clear and the grass is so green." Sarah's eyes scanned the scene and she breathed deeply as she smelled the sweet grass. "It probably never stops raining," Nanny Louisa uttered darkly. You're just you're just feeling grumpy again," Sarah said brightly. "And who wouldn't feel grumpy? We've been transported like sardines in a tin, and now we're dumped like unwanted fish on a desolate dock. Train travel is simply not what it used to be. I'm sure Uncle Alec will be along soon." "Punctuality is the sign of a gentleman. Well, not telling how long we may have to wait. We'd better get our luggage inside the station in case it rains. There isn't a cloud in the sky." "Never mind. You can never be too careful when you're traveling. Come along, Sarah. You'll have to help me." Sarah took one of the bags, and Nanny Louisa took another. They made three trips between the platform and the station. "We'll put it all right here," Nanny Louisa announced, piling all their luggage in a single stack. right next to the only bench under the station's roof. That task completed, she was utterly breathless and collapsed onto the bench. She eyed the luggage and counted each piece. They had 3 carpet bags, 3 large baskets, and 4 hat boxes. Sarah looked around the bleak station and then sat down on the wooden bench, primly folding her hands in her lap. She had hoped there would be a little restaurant where they could have tea, but there was no such thing. In fact, there was next to nothing. A fine kettle of fish, Nanny muttered. Her Here we are in the middle of nowhere and nobody to meet us. Where the devil is that Alec King? Sarah looked curiously about while Nanny Louisa continued to complain. What a dreadful trip. I thought that ferry would sink. I feared I'd meet my maker. Keep your hands on your bag, my dear. Thieves abound when you travel. You can't be too careful. Nanny, the station is quite empty. You needn't worry so much. Sarah stood up and stretched, walking a few steps down the platform. Louisa looked about uneasily and wondered if coming to this place had been a good idea after all. Born and reared in London, she had never lived in a rural setting. British to the core, she had certain standards and considered the entire North American continent, apart from Montreal and Boston, somewhat primitive. Excuse me. Excuse me. My throat really hurts right now. Nearly 70, her long ago memory of London had taken on a kind of mythical quality. Coming here was the only practical thing to do, she murmured under her breath. But even as she said it, she feared the worst. Well, she vowed, if everything was not satisfactory, we will simply have to make it satisfactory. Louisa shook loose of her thoughts. Sarah, don't you wander off, she called out. Then to herself, the only safe way to travel with young ones is to have them tied to you with a short rope. She studied the hat box, which once again threatened to slide down the untidy mountain of luggage. Suddenly, the boy appeared, rounding the corner of the station. He carried a tattered carpet bag and wore his cap slightly twisted on his head. He tipped it to Nanny Louisa. Ma'am, he muttered. It's you, she responded, frowning at him suspiciously. Did you find your mouse? Sarah asked. Don't talk to strangers, warned Nanny Louisa. While Sarah and Nanny Louisa devoted their attention to the boy, a large man parked his buggy behind the station, climbed down, and headed for the platform. When he saw Sarah and the boy, he grinned and said loudly, Sarah Stanley and Andrew King. I do believe the train got in a bit early. Sarah stared at the man, then at the boy. The boy stared at her, then the man. The man laughed. So here are the 2 long-lost King cousins. Welcome to Prince Edward Island. I'm your uncle, Alec King. Sarah stared hard at the boy her nanny had called Rowdy. Then, almost in unison, she and the boy both said, Cousins? Then, and into the carriage with both of you, Alec King said cheerfully. Sarah paused. And this is my Nanny Louisa, she announced. Alec looked at Nanny Louisa a bit strangely, but after a moment he mumbled that he was glad to meet her. Then he rubbed his chin thoughtfully and turned to Andrew. What did you say, young man? What do you say, young man? How about helping me tie this luggage on the back of the buggy? Nanny Louisa stared at Alec King. She wondered again if her suggestion that Sarah come here had been the right one. The place appeared more primitive than she had thought it would be, and certainly Mr. Alec King did not look as refined as she had hoped Ruth's relatives would be. "Ladies," announced Alec King cheerfully, "your chariot awaits." "If only it were here," Nanny said under her breath as she eyed the buggy. Alec King helped Nanny Louisa into the buggy and then seated Sarah next to her. "You'll have to sit up front with me," he told Andrew. "Come on, let's go." They clattered off, and Nanny Louisa grasped Sarah's hand for dear life. "The luggage will fall off," she predicted darkly. "The buggy might even turn over. Oops, what a bumpy road. Do hold on tight, Sarah. Oops." Alec King turned slightly. "We've been expecting Andrew for a while. My brother, Andrew's father, has taken a temporary job in South America. He spends his time looking for rocks, doesn't he, Andrew?" "He's a geologist," Andrew said loudly. Nanny Louisa smoothed out her skirt. "I was unaware of the fact that there would be another child staying with you, let alone a ruffian." Her nose twitched ever so slightly. "I do hope this won't make any difference to our accommodations." Alec laughed. "Of course not. I'm sure we can find a space for you overnight." Nanny Louisa sat straight up and rigid. "My dear man, what do you mean by overnight? I will be here for the duration of Sarah's visit. Heaven help you you do if you don't have a suitable accommodation." Alec drew his breath and vowed not to turn around. This Nanny Louisa seemed to expect rather a lot. Well, it wasn't for him to deal with that prissy woman. No, his wife, or better yet, his sister Hetty, could deal with her. He smiled to himself. Yes, Hetty would put her in her place, and no doubt on the next train as well. Sarah uncle's wondered at her uncle's surprise that Nanny Louisa was with her, but only for a moment. So many new sensations were flooding over her. She drew a deep breath and leaned back in the buggy. The air was wonderful, and the scenery. The ocean was blue and sparkled as if diamonds floated on its surface. Green hills gave way to golden hills of farms in the distance, and the bright red earth she had seen from the train seemed ever so redder now. Blue seas and red cliffs covered with green grass. "It is beautiful," she sighed. "Isn't it beautiful, Nanny Louisa?" Now I know why Mama loved her home so much. But Louisa was not to be mollified. After all, she'd been brought up near the Thames, and she'd visited the famed white cliffs of Dover. "It's possible," she grumbled, "for the colonies." Wow, I do not like her. Sarah ignored her. It was more than passable. It was her mother's home, and it was wonderful. Still, the people seemed peculiar, and she wondered if they would like her. She thought of her papa, wondering if he were thinking of her, and even as she thought of him, she felt sad and a little lost. Chapter 5. Oh, it's 10:14. Okay. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to. Ow. Sorry, my computer's on a table tray and I just hit my leg on a table tray. Okay, so I'm gonna have to finish this book later. Like, I don't know if it's today or probably tomorrow, but my mom and I are going to lunch, so I've got to go pick her up. So I will see you all later. And I'm on chapter 5 now.